Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of the public initiative hosted by US Asia Institute, Northeast Asia in Focus. This specific series provides opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia. For those who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the USAI, thank you for joining us. My name is Joseph Izumi, and I'm the program assistant at the US Asia Institute. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. First, I would like to give a special thanks to USAID's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. Now, moving on to today's program, I would like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Riley Walters. Mr. Riley Walters is a Deputy Director of the Hudson Institute Japan Chair. His research includes expanding economic ties and promoting closer scientific technological collaboration between the United States and Japan. Mr. Riley is also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow with the Global Taiwan Institute. Prior to joining Hudson, he was a Senior Policy Analyst and Economist in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Riley has appeared on national television and radio extensively, and has written for a variety of publications, including The Hill, Japan Times, The Diplomat, The Washington Times, Geopolitical Intelligence Service, and others. You will be able to read more about Riley in our program found in the chat function. We're very fortunate to have him with us today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Riley, to introduce today's fellow panelists and kick off this briefing.
All right. Thank you for the kind introduction, Joseph. As Joseph said, my name is Riley Walters. I'm at Hudson Institute. I'm also at the Global Taiwan Institute. Things I'd be happy to talk about at a different time, because today we're going to be talking a little bit on a different topic with two other experts. I just, of course, want to thank everyone for showing up today, especially the congressional staffers who've, I'm sure, had a very busy month. And we appreciate the time for you taking to learn more about Northeast Asia. Today's briefing is going to be an overview of US Northeast Asia investment trends. We're going to have quick introductions from our two panelists, including myself. Then we'll go into a Q&A and hopefully end promptly around 4 p.m. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. Up first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kiyoshi Tanigawa. Tanigawa-san is the Executive Director of Keidanren USA. He joined Keidanren more than 2 decades ago and has engaged in public policy advocacy throughout his career. Prior to his current position, he was responsible for energy and climate change policy, deeply engaged in policymaking at both the national and international levels, as well as initiating various projects by the Japanese business community. Mr. Tanigawa is also known for his experience in such areas as industrial policy, regulatory reform, innovation, trade, and Asian affairs. Next after him will be Mr. Wayne Morrison. Mr. Morrison is a retired specialist in Asian trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service, where he worked for 36 years. He was the leading CRS specialist on China's economy and US-China commercial relations, where he wrote numerous CRS reports, many of which I'm sure you've read, on US-China economic and trade relations. Beginning his career at CRS in 1983, he was transferred to the International Trade and Financial section in 1988, where he began working as an analyst on US commercial ties with Asia, as well as US government export promotion programs, US trade remedy laws, protection of US intellectual property rights, and congressional policies to address foreign unfair trade practices. Between 2017 and 2019, Mr. Morrison served as an adjunct professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell in Washington program. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Kiyoshi-san for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having us today. And before going to the topic, may I just briefly introduce about the Keidanren? Keidanren is established in 1946 and is the largest business organization in Japan and has long been recognized and respected as the leading voice for Japanese businesses. With our membership of 1,500 representative Japanese firms and 108 nationwide industrial associations, we seek to establish consensus in the business community on various variety of important domestic and international issues, and we work for their steady and prompt resolution. Keidanren USA is the U.S. liaison entity for Keidanren. Its core mission is to facilitate more engagement by the Japanese business sectors with the U.S. policymaking community and to promote the very real contributions in terms of investment and jobs being made by Japanese companies to the U.S. economies. The United States and Japan are top economic partners and global leaders who share common values on democracy and free and open international economic orders. We should continue to build our relationships into a stronger and more resilient economic alliance. Both countries have demonstrated their mutual commitment to one another through strong trade and investment. The United States is a top destination for Japanese foreign direct investments, and Japan is now the United States' largest foreign investors with nearly $720 billion in cumulative stock through 2021. And Japanese businesses employ hundreds of thousands of American employees in 2019, and especially Japanese companies lease all foreign nations in the United States manufacturing jobs. Moreover, Japanese investment in the United States continues with $40 billion in investment flows in 2021. Manufacturing stands for approximately half of investment, and solid growth was seen in transportation equipment, chemicals, wholesales, and finance insurance. An important feature of Japanese investment is that many Japanese-owned companies operating in the United States engage in a broad range of activities to contribute to American society while developing long-term partnerships as good corporate citizens within the communities and states in which they operate. And not limited to foreign direct investment, but in general, investments by Japanese firms in fiscal year 2022 is expected to recover to 2019 levels, with a significant increase planned due to the resumption of investment postponed due to COVID, as well as an acceleration of decarbonization and digitalizations, and a boost from efforts to strengthen resilience. There will be a growing movement to strengthen resilience, including supply chain resilience from the aspect of economic securities, such as securing strategic inventories amid increasing risks such as restructuring of international orders. Decarbonization efforts will continue to focus on renewable energy efficiency, and EVs this year. Overseas capital investment declined domestically and internationally after 2019, but overseas investment quickly picked up in 2021 and is expected to increase significantly again in 2022. According to a JETRO survey of Japanese companies, the US became the top destination for future business expansion destination for the first time. Top industry sectors were textile clothing, electrical equipment, and food and beverages, with 70 to 80% of firms citing the US as a destination for business expansion. Top functions to be expanded in the US were sales, R&D, regional headquarters, and logistics. With these trends, we expect that bilateral ties to be stronger and resilient even more. Thank you.
No, thank you. That was really great, I think, highlighting the importance and sort of the depth of the US-Japan economic relationship. I don't know if everyone always recognizes how actually mature the US-Japan economic relationship is. I mean, we are two of the top economies in the world. We have a lot of strong, a lot of trade and investment going back and forth. And so it's really important that we maintain that progress. Up next, Wayne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ryan. It's good to be with you today. Thank you for US Asia Institute for inviting me. So I want to talk about US-China investment relations and try to describe how big it is and a little bit about the background. First of all, I'd like to say that there are really kind of two types of foreign investment to talk about when it comes to China. And the first one has to do with securities. And in that regard, China is one of the largest investors in the United States because China has become one of the biggest holders of US Treasury securities. Those are very important because these securities are used to fund the US budget deficits. So early in the 2000s, China began to sharply increase those purchases. It went from 118 in 2002 to 1.2 trillion in 2012. For many years, China was by far the largest holder of the securities. China's holdings has declined in recent years. Japan is actually number one, but China has almost $1 trillion still in treasury securities. So that's a big investment in the US economy. The other kind of investment that is talked about are really investment in real assets, companies and ventures and things of that nature. In that case, China's investment in the United States really didn't start until around 2005. China's economy was still focused on domestic development, but the government began to encourage some companies to go forward and invest to help with their own competitiveness and integrate with the global economy. And so some of those investments did come to the United States. Now, the total amount of investment in the United States is kind of hard to measure because there are many different sources of it. So the US government Bureau of Economic Affairs, they estimate the total investment in the United States from China's investment at 54 billion. But there are groups that contend this is a very low number, doesn't really reflect the total number because a lot of investment into the United States from China is coming in via other places like Cayman Islands or something. So there's one particular organization that I think is very good, and that's the American Enterprise Institute. They have a China investment tracker run by Derek Scissors, who actually tracks every Chinese investment across the world of 95 million or more. And he does it not just for the United States, but for every country. It's a very useful thing. But according to his estimates, that China has invested almost $190 billion in the United States. That's 3 times more than what BEA estimates. So basically, from 2005 to 2012, China's investment averaged around 8.4 billion. But then afterwards, from 2005 to 2005 to 2012. I'm sorry, let me say it again. 2012 to 2018, China's foreign investment really began to pick up, and it was almost triple the amount from the previous period. The biggest year was in 2016, where China, according to the American Enterprise Institute, invested $55 billion in the United States. Now, the thing about investment from China, although it has benefited the US economy, and most Chinese projects have been able to operate without any problems, there have been some controversial investments. And I'll just read you a couple, the most controversial ones. So in 2005, a Chinese state company tried to purchase Unocal Corporation, a US oil company, for $18.5 billion. And that led to a firestorm of protests from Congress. They didn't want a Chinese state-owned company buying huge, oil assets. And especially at that time, the price of gas was pretty high. But they were also concerned because it was a state-owned company being financed by Chinese state banks. In 2012, President Obama issued an executive order that blocked Chinese wind power company from operating in Oregon because it was located near a Navy base, and so it was considered a threat to national security. In 2013, a Chinese investment group, Shuang Shui Group, bought Smithfield Ham for $7.2 billion. And although that deal did go through, it raised a lot of concerns in Congress about U.S. Food security, as well as food safety. In 2017, President Trump blocked Chinese acquisition of Lattice Semiconductor Corporation for $1.3 billion. And one thing that was noted in that executive order is that the Chinese investment group was sort of a shady group. It was never clear who the actual owners were, and the suspicions were that in fact it was the Chinese government operating through what appeared to be a private investment firm, trying to gain access to U.S. technology by buying this company. Later on in 2018, Congress did in fact pass major legislation to revamp U.S. foreign investment approval laws, dealing with the U.S. organization that reviews such investments, CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. They made major changes to that to make it much tougher for foreign adversaries to purchase U.S. companies in technology, emerging technologies, et cetera. And the thing about that legislation is there's language in there that, although it doesn't name China, everybody knows they mean China, because this is what it says. One of the considerations that the president and the CFIUS group is supposed to make when they're looking at a transaction is if they involve a country of, quote, special concern that has a strategic goal of acquiring critical technology or critical infrastructure that would affect U.S. leadership in areas of national security. So many feel that this was a direct attempt to try to block China's attempt to gain access to U.S. technology. The U.S. does not want to help China advance in several emerging technologies that have both economic and foreign national security implications. So that has had a really big impact, I think, on the sort of overall relationship with China on foreign investment. Foreign investment did slow down after that legislation was passed, and fell to about $3 billion in 2019. In the past couple of years, 1.7, I think, in 2020 and 2021, I think it was the same. Although a lot of that, of course, was COVID and the economic slowdown. But what we're seeing is, I think, that there's frustration from many in Congress. It's great, always great to have foreign investment coming in. But the problem is that a lot of the investment from China seems to be coming from state-owned companies or companies that say they're private, but you're not always sure if the government has a hand in their operations. A lot of the investment are just simply acquisitions. Probably 90% are, according to some estimates. So only 10% are greenfield, which are like new plants, new ventures. So they really aren't creating that many jobs. A lot of members complain because while our country is open for foreign investment in most ways, that in China they do impose a lot of restrictions there. Hard to tell what will happen now in the future once we see more normal economic relations in terms of less COVID restrictions, et cetera. How the Chinese are going to respond to the new laws on FDI here, and et cetera. But it's going to be much more difficult for China, not impossible, for them to buy U.S. companies that are high technology firms, doesn't mean that they can't invest in other areas. And it doesn't even mean that they can't invest in technology, but that is something we'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you offered a number of good anecdotes of both Chinese investment that has cleared the review processes and those that haven't. And so those are really good lessons to be learned. One thing you were talking about, and I really dove into this recently, when we're talking about foreign investment, just for all you out there who want to look more into this, the Treasury Department releases data on what's called resident-based FDI and national-based FDI. And so this kind of separates between entities that are basically separating between the parent company's country of origin and where the FDI is actually coming from. So like Wayne was talking about, you've got Chinese companies in the Cayman Islands, and sometimes when you're looking at the balance of payments, it comes up as Cayman Islands. Well, really, if you look at it from a national point of view, it's Chinese. So that could probably help, separate some of that data out, really figure out. And that's really one of the issues that I have when I'm looking at foreign investment, at least from the security side. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the Japanese side in just a second, but from the security side, a lot of, I think, our concerns are well-founded, but also need a lot more information. I don't think we really do have a good hold on a lot of the investment flows. And I say we, I mean Washington, Congress and the executive, on where money is actually coming from, where it's going. We do have a lot more insight into the foreign direct investment coming into the United States. It's much easier to say, don't build a 5G cell tower next to our nuclear weapons facility than it is to say, X, Y, and Z company don't build or invest in companies abroad. So, there is this debate going on about outbound investment reviews, and it's something that requires a lot more, I think, investigating. Going to the Japan relationship real quick, though, that is one area that I think there's a lot of areas for cooperation. The Japanese, Wayne was talking about Committee on Foreign Investment, CFIUS reform back a few years ago. And the Japanese since then have also done a lot to reform their own foreign investment reviewing mechanisms, because they want to align very closely with the United States on this. I mean, really a lot of our partners and allies, particularly in Asia, do. I mean, they don't want their companies having to deal with a lot of red tape, because red tape ultimately hurts business decisions, which hurts investment, which hurts trade and services. So, we want to remove those barriers as much as possible to benefit not just American companies, but our friends in Asia as well, because their economic success is important for us as well. One last thing is, I don't know how much we want to dive into this, but economic security has become more of a discussion, I think, amongst various capitals. In Japan, there's new economic security legislation, or a law that was passed talking about this, but it's not something that I think we really have consensus on. And so I think it's interesting to look at this from various perspectives. Some people look at it from a technology perspective. Some people look at it purely from an economic competitiveness angle. How are our jobs, how are our wages, how is our equity and diversity in our employment looking? There's so many different ways to approach this, which can also make it difficult. And so I think finding consensus on this topic, not just domestically, but with our international partners, will be something that will take a lot more effort from Congress, from the executive, and so on. I do have a few questions. If you haven't submitted questions already, please go ahead in the chat function. I will be moderating those, but I've got a few of my own teed up here real quick. And Tanigawa-san, I'm going to start with you. The pandemic, I think, has really shifted a lot of business sentiment. It's not just changed our international trade and investment relationships, but it's also affected our domestic businesses as well, and how they think about doing business. I basically work from home still. I'm more in the office, but more or less still working from home. And so I want to get I want to ask you, how has the Japanese business sector recovered from the pandemic, and how has that in any way influenced sort of the way they think about business, both nationally in Japan and internationally, particularly within the United States?
For the pandemic, the Japanese economy is now beginning to recover. And for the Japanese businesses, we had been realizing that resilience issue is really important, which has raised the importance of economic security. And at the same time, social issues such as healthcare, biotechnologies, energy issues, and food crisis, we have, in conjunction with the Ukraine issues, we have been aware that we have to balance security issues with free and open economic orders. And with that respect, may I just touch upon 4 points, what we like for the Congress staffers to understand about our suggestions. And
Yeah, go ahead.
One issue is maintaining level playing field within the United States. And second is the importance of economic security. And the third is the cooperation in IPEF. And the fourth is on energy and climate change. For the maintain level playing field, many of our member companies and their subsidiaries have operations here in the United States. And they are, for all intents and purposes, operating here as US companies, investing in US communities and employing US citizens. And as such, they're impacted by any US policy that impacts the US business environment, the same as US companies. They should not be singled out for discriminatory treatment simply because the parent company is based in Japan. We hope that the US will continue to have the open and welcoming investment climate that first attracted our companies here. And regarding economic security that you have touched upon, while we recognize the importance of economic security, where more efforts should be taken, Keidanren believes that restriction on trade and investment to meet economic security requirements need to be limited to the truly necessary minimum extent. Both US and Japanese companies have already expanded their supply chain globally, and simplistic calls for decoupling may lead to fragmentation and the creation of blocks. Even if the government is involved in such efforts, it should focus on supporting corporate efforts rather than relying on regulatory mechanisms. Japan, as a next-year chair of the G7, needs to take a lead in maintaining and promoting free trade and investment under the current challenging international environment. Keidanren is advocating for the establishment of the high-level trade and investment framework, namely a free trade and investment club, with G7 member at its core. The club will be open to any country or region committing to criteria on issues such as tariff eliminations, prohibition of direct investment performance requirements, and cross-border data flows. Keidanren seeks the understanding and support of Member of Congress of this FDI club initiatives. For IPEF, realizing the free and open Indo-Pacific to ensure peace and prosperity in the region and the international community is critical. Keidanren welcomes the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as a sign of the US continuing its engagement and leadership role in the region. On the other hand, IPEF does not include market access. In this regard, it is important to establish rules for the free flow of data across borders, IPEF is expected to play a role to include and coordinate these roles. We look forward to seeing more details as the participating countries continue their discussion. Furthermore, in order to rebuild a free and open international economic order, the Japanese business community is eager to see the US return to the CPTPP. While we are well aware of the political difficulties, we believe that the CPTPP will play a significant role in attracting investment to the United States. And finally, regarding energy and climate, the US and Japan should also strengthen cooperation in areas such as competitiveness and innovation, energy and climate change. Various collaborations are already underway in 5G, beyond 5G, cybersecurity, and semiconductors. Also in the energy and climate change area, cooperation on clean energy and technologies is progressing. In particular, the IEA estimates that the global investment required to achieve energy security and carbon neutrality by 2030 amounts to $4 trillion. Japan-US cooperation should work on the development and diffusion of innovative technologies.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of great things there. I'll just pick up on the last one first. The energy aspect is really important. I particularly talk a lot with our friends from Taiwan about their energy security, but Japan is in a very similar situation, not exactly the same, but it is a island country that relies heavily on the import of energy, and so there's more that needs to be done for sure between our countries on energy diversification, and of course the transition to green energy. But the other thing you mentioned, which is actually I think a great opportunity, and I plan to write a lot more on this soon, is you mentioned Japan will be leading the G7 next year. The United States will also be leading APEC. And I think of this as sort of a 1-2 punch that we could really pull between our two countries on leading on some of these issues. And so I look forward to that. I hope we can actually pull something out. Wayne, let me go to you real quick. We talked a little bit just now about the business community in Japan and how they're thinking about sort of the future of the relationship. And, we're talking about how countries are opening back up, but China isn't particularly opening back up just yet. They still have their zero COVID policy. And I want to get your opinion on how this has affected the Chinese economy and has been affecting Chinese investments and trade with the US and rest of the world.
Well, sure. Well, I think the COVID crackdowns have had a particularly hard impact on China's economy. I mean, you see things on the news of workers for the Apple phones running away from a factory they were quarantined in, trying to get away. These things have caused a lot of problems within China. It really hurt domestic consumption. China was already experiencing a lot of economic problems. And as we all know, in China, the economy is job one for the Communist Party. A slowing economy is their biggest threat. And the thought that the Chinese economy is probably going to slow to about 3.3% for this year alone is quite substantial to me. I don't remember it being that low ever in all the years I worked on China. And long term, the IMF is looking at an average rate about 4.4% on average for China. So China is beginning to stumble a little bit economically. There does seem to be some problems internally where the priority is with President Xi. He doesn't seem to be focused on economic reforms the way China once was. He's more focused on making China self-sufficient on technology and on dealing with more strategic issues, et cetera. So that could be affecting the economy. One thing I would like to point out about China's foreign investment trends is that we saw like a peak of China's global investment in 2016. So that was the big year in the United States too. We saw some of China's big companies come in. One group, in fact, the HNA Group, huge Chinese conglomerate, between 2016 and 2017, they bought something like they had $26 billion in investments in the United States in all sorts of sectors. Interesting enough, in 2021, that company faced bankruptcy, and the CEO was arrested. There's another Chinese company called Anbang Insurance. They bought bought a lot of hotels in New York City, and they also went into bankruptcy themselves. The Chinese government has been very upset that while it opened the doors for overseas investment, gave the approvals, a lot of these companies proved to get in all sorts of bad type of investments. So the Chinese government it's much more reluctant now to let those companies let its companies invest overseas, and that's probably why we've seen that kind of decline in foreign investment until they can get a better hold on allowing sort of more quality investments. Because surprisingly, the biggest Chinese investment in the United States is not technology, it's real estate, right? So they do like to buy a lot of, fancy buildings in New York City and in LA, but have not really done too much otherwise. And that's kind of a shame because, one good thing of what the Japanese have done is that they put a lot of money in manufacturing in the United States. And according to the BEA, Japan's investments support 1.1 million American jobs, whereas Chinese investment only supports 159,000. It would be a big plus for the Chinese politically if they actually had more manufacturing in the United States. It would give them a little bit more good publicity in terms of the relationship with China, when right now most of the news seems to be negative.
You'd be cutting into their market share. The Chinese want to keep manufacturing for the United States. While I have you on real estate, though, we do have a question, and there's been increasing concerns about Chinese purchases of U.S. farmland, and I think real estate gets caught up in that discussion sometimes as well. What's your sense on this topic? I mean, what degree is Chinese purchases of U.S. farmland as much a national security concern as it is more of maybe an economic or political concern?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question because it's been very prominent in the news. So I think a lot of these issues have come up because there is a Chinese company, I think it's called Fufeng, that has announced they want to build a corn producing facility in North Dakota. The problem is that it's 12 miles away from an Air Force base. And so some are saying, well, this is a risk to national security. And that may or may not be. And that is something that CFIUS is looking at. However, so while many members have written letters and asked the administration for information about that aspect of that planned plant there, if you read some of these letters, they go into things that are sort of much more complex. And one of them is, if we allow the Chinese to control our food supply, they could try to cut us off, right? I mean, that was the same argument that occurred when the Chinese when a Chinese company bought Smithfield Ham. And I think part of the problem has been that there is that national security concern that has to be settled by CFIUS, whether having a plant there is a problem. But the whole idea that a corn producing plant that will produce jobs for the people in that community, in a way, it's kind of surprising to hear complaints about that. And if you look on the internet, you can see some of the meetings they've had there. There've been a lot of angry constituents there, very upset because the Chinese government is linked to the project, the Communist Party, and they have a bad record on human rights. They're against America. You hear all those kind of things, and to me, it's a disturbing thing. But it is unfortunate because now we're seeing legislation that would try to ban Chinese investment in U.S. farmland, not just Chinese, but other foreign investment there. So in a sense, it's almost an overreaction, right? Not focused on the correct problem. And what would the Chinese actually do with this farmland? They can't take it home with them. So in a sense that it would be difficult to feel that somehow that they could, like, if there's a major dispute with China, that they're going to stop producing corn or whatever, it doesn't seem very feasible. I mean, we definitely want to attract legitimate investment from China, that provides jobs and opportunities throughout the United States. And the other thing I'd like to say too is we certainly don't want to cut off China from access to investing in the United States, because American companies have a lot of money invested in China. China's a huge market, 1.4 billion people. If we get cut out of the Chinese market, it's going to hurt a lot of U.S. companies as well.
Yeah, thanks for touching on that. Yeah, I think it's another one of these topics that requires a lot more, a better look at it, and not just get caught up sort of in the day-to-day jargon when we talk about the threat that China presents as an overall competitor. Going back to Japan,
Ryan, I'm sorry, could I just cut in one more real quick?
Yeah.
Because it was a point that I didn't make. The one thing that has caused a lot of confusion on this issue of Chinese purchase of U.S. farmland is because the USDA has listed that China's holdings of U.S. agricultural property increased 26-fold from 2010 to 2020. So that has given the impression that there's this massive attempt by Chinese to buy all this land. But actually, 76% of China's holdings are the Smithfield Ham purchase. That's most of where that came from. Therefore, there hasn't really been a surge in China's purchases of American farmland. It was taken from that statistic, but it doesn't really reflect what's going on beside that one big purchase. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a good point. It's important to look at trends, not just sort of pick specific statistics out of the year. Speaking of statistics, I was asked to briefly mention the exchange rates between the United States and Japan right now. If any of you are following this, then you probably know. If not, the Japanese yen has been weakening against the U.S. dollar. I believe it's around 140 to $1. When I was there in college, it was about 80 to $1, which I thought was unfair for a poor college kid like me. But now it's reversed, and so the Japanese yen is weak against the dollar. Some of this has to do with the variation in interest rates between the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan. Some of it also spreads out into general business sentiment and the effects that inflation are having, the variance in inflation that the United States is seeing and Japan is seeing. I won't actually talk too much about the US dollar, but I think for the Japanese yen's weakening, it is becoming more of a problem. Japanese, again, import a lot of their energy. Luckily, a lot of those contracts are long-term, so they're not feeling as much effects or much short-term effects, I think, as other countries are, but it's beginning to weigh in a certain sense. And so, the way that I perceive what's happening with the yen, what the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan are doing, and what the Treasury Department and Ministry of Finance in Japan are thinking, the way that I look at it is it's a bit of a cat and mouse game right now. Obviously, the Fed wants to sort of initiate recessionary characteristics in our economy so we can slow it down so that inflation aren't as high, so the Japanese Bank of Japan, on the other hand, is hoping to wait that out. The Ministry of Finance is, of course, selling some of their treasuries, their holdings of foreign reserves, in an effort to slow the rate of depreciation of the yen. And I think it's been working. About a month ago, I think it was at around 150 to $1. And so it's a bit of, kind of a game of chicken almost, if you will. I've got tons of analogies I can call, but that's the general sense of it. What that means is, if we're thinking of just general economics, a low yen is good for American importers and great for Japanese exporters, but it's not great for Japanese importers and US exporters to Japan. So let me go back to our panelists real quick. And Wayne, we talked about this a little bit. Tanigawa-san, maybe you can chime in as well. There is perhaps more of an interest in the national security implications of not just foreign direct investment, but the economic policy overall. And so to what degree should policymakers concern themselves with this intermingling of economics and national security? And you feel free to take it from different perspectives. Again, I think, the US has one perspective on this. I think the Japanese government and businesses have maybe a different. And so maybe Tanigawa-san, if you want to go first, what are your thoughts on this?
I think economic security aspects has gaining great concerns on the Japanese business communities. And we think that many things that has to be done. And recently, Japanese government has passed the Economic Security Promotion Act. And we're still figuring out the details. But one thing we have to say that the restriction or regulation should be in the minimum to maintain the free and open economic orders.
Thank you. And Wayne, to you, but Wayne, let me actually tack on to yours, since you're coming at it maybe from a bit more of a China angle. I can't talk about national security without talking about export controls. So maybe if you also have a couple of thoughts on the recent export control restrictions that the Commerce Department imposed on US and foreign semiconductor manufacturing in China.
So that issue of economic security is one that someone like me, who's an economist, really struggles with. Part of the problem is economic security is a lot different than national security. Economic security can be anything, right? And we have found in the past that many members considered the industries in their district to be, of national security or economic security importance. And then I would also comment that during the Trump administration, to me, they very weakened that whole argument of national security, economic security, when he imposed tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum, arguing that economic security was national security. I thought that was a very poor use of that and a very poor link. But having said that, because of the challenge from China, so China wants to be an economic superpower. They want to be a technological superpower, and all that's super and that's fine and this and that. The problem is the fact that they're using state-directed efforts to do that. So when you look at their Made in China 2025 plan, so it's a plan to make 10 industries dominant producers, not just in China, but eventually the world. And that causes a lot of concern. And when you think about semiconductors, the Chinese said, well, we want to spend $60 billion to develop our own semiconductor industry. And you think about that from an economist point of view, you would say, well, that's a big waste of money for the government to do that. But at the same time, you can also imagine the kind of damage that would do to US semiconductor companies. If a Chinese company can be made competitive through that massive influx of money, if those companies can then gain a dominant position in China, they could gain a dominant market position in the world and drive US companies out of business. So that definitely is something that we've got to be concerned about. That's one of the reasons why we're not only limiting China's investment in US semiconductor production in the United States, we're also imposing strict export controls on high-end semiconductors to keep them out of the hands of the Chinese, because we don't want them to gain access to that IPR and technology, because we don't want to see them dominate these high-tech and emerging industries. And that certainly is something of concern. The only problem is that we saw with Japan and other countries in the past. So the US is trying to identify these emerging technologies that we have to protect. And governments aren't always right about that. And sometimes when they do impose restrictions, that's a problem. And we also know that that the federal government recently passed a bill to provide $50 billion for the CHIPS Act for helping our own producers, and which makes you wonder, like, what is the significance of us subsidizing our industries? And in fact, to me, it sounds like we are trying to stop China by becoming more like China. And that's something that kind of bothers me in that broad concept. But how do we respond to China is a subject that is of importance.
I've got, I think, one final question for each of you before we close out for today. We are in the midst of a G20 summit out in Bali. We've seen reports of President Biden meeting with Xi Jinping and statements being made over Taiwan. And some of the general sense that I get, my takeaway from that is, a lot of countries in Asia right now are having a bit of sigh of relief that things haven't gotten worse, but haven't, it's sort of like status quo. Things are, I wouldn't say amicable, but quiet, and that's good in their opinion. So based off of that, I wonder, Tanigawa-san, how does the business community in Japan look at US-China relations for their sort of business sentiment? And, again, based off maybe things have changed overnight. And then, Wayne, if you can, one of the things that this administration has talked a lot about in their dialogue of not just talking about competing with China, they've also talked a lot about areas of cooperation on things like, climate control being one of them. Can we really find areas of cooperation anymore with China, or has the nature of the relationship changed just so much that at this point it's just all rhetoric? Tanigawa-san, let me start with you. What's the business community look at the US-China relationship?
So there was a summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. And I really think that the stability of the US-China bilateral relationships is extremely important for the international community and maintaining a sound business environment. And the Japanese government and the Japanese business should continue to cooperate in the various ways with its ally, the only ally, United States, which is based on the strong relation of trust. And for the Japan-China relations, for Japan, China is a neighboring country, which we have a close and mutual beneficial economic relationships. And we still have to see how President Xi, on what kind of strategies and specific policy China would adopt in the future. And for ourselves, we think that there's still many issues and concerns about China. But it really is necessary to build a constructive and stable bilateral relationships between Japan and China as well. And we are going to maintain our policy dialogues with the Chinese business communities and also with the government, as well as US business communities and US governments to maintain stable relationships among these countries and to contribute to the prosperity of the Asian Pacific regions.
Yeah, I think stability is really important for business decisions. You can't make billion-dollar investments on a whim. You really need to know if a company wants to come to America, they need to have faith that where they're investing and their investments will, be, can go through. And I think the Japanese have been very successful, not just as the largest investor in the United States, but also becoming an integral partner in Southeast Asia. You see polls of Southeast Asian nations, and Japan is at the top of their preferred economies to work with. So Wayne, over to you. What are the chances of cooperation with China?
Well, being a Red Sox fan, I'm always very optimistic about a good outcome. So I do think that it's very, everybody takes great notice at the meeting between Xi and Biden, and sort of making positive statements about cooperation, et cetera. I actually think that the U.S. really should try to accelerate these one-on-one meetings. We used to have so many of them. For example, we used to have the strategic and economic dialogue. These were meetings between the two sides at the highest levels. We used to have those every year. They were ended under Trump. We ought to have those. We are actually negotiating with the Chinese on a bilateral investment treaty in which the Chinese were saying they were going to open up many sectors to foreign investment. I mean, that was important, but that also was terminated. Because of the kind of negative rhetoric that we're seeing coming from both countries. I mean, tell you the truth, I don't think I've ever seen it this bad all the years I worked on U.S.-China relations, and there were some bad years. If you go into the database and look for legislation on China, just type in the word China, you'll find 800 bills. And I've only had a chance to go through like 200 of those. They're almost overwhelmingly anti-China, just overwhelmingly condemning China for this, condemning China for that. To me, that's just mostly very bad rhetoric that really doesn't really solve anything and just makes the Chinese furious. So many of the staffers who are listening probably will go on one of the U.S. Asia Institute trips to China when they start up again, if they haven't already. And you'll go there and you'll go to meetings and they'll say, last year the Congress introduced X amount of bills, and it hurt the feelings of 1.4 billion people. The Chinese, they take notice of these kind of things. And to me, there's has to be we have to sort of tone down the rhetoric a little bit, because China is a country that we're going to have to work with. And it's easier to work together when you're a friend than when you're an enemy. So I do think that these kind of dialogues are important. I remember former Ambassador and Senator Max Baucus, his solution to the problems between the US and China, he said every year, he said, go get a Boeing 787, fill it up with members of Congress and journalists, and fly to Beijing, and then fly to 3 other major cities, then fly to 5 small cities and meet with local officials, and then do it every single year. Because the thing dealing with the Chinese is getting to understand them and building that relationship with them. And in all the years I was at CRS, one of the most important things I felt was to give them an understanding of how the Chinese view themselves, and a little bit about their own history, okay? Because I would say that right now the Chinese feel that the US is trying to keep them down. They've always suspected that, for years, American policymakers try to convince them, no, we welcome you into the global community. We want to see you successful, and we just want you to be a responsible stakeholder. But now the Chinese feel the US is just out to get them, trying to prevent them from their day in the sun, et cetera. It's too bad that they feel that way. So we got to convince the Chinese that we want to work with them, but we do expect certain types of behavior from them, right?
And I think another thing that Chinese also think is that a lot of American politicians are full of hot wind. So I would definitely caution, not to put the cart before the horse. If rhetoric is nice, but I think it's actually also important to invest in things like our national defense and so on and so forth, instead of just saying these things, actually do it. I heard a great idiom today: a lot of thunder, but you don't see a lot of rain. And so it'd be great to see a lot more rain, I think, and less thunder on some of these issues. Anyways, thank you both for your comments today. I think we came at it from two different directions. One, our largest and one of our most strategically important alliances, the US-Japan alliance and investment that we have there. And then another one, Chinese investment, which does tend to crop up more in the national security debate. I think this is definitely a conversation we can continue for many more sessions, but I'll let Joseph deal with the planning on that. Again, thank you all for turning out today. We know you're busy and appreciate you taking the time to join us. I turn back over now to Joseph for any final announcements.
Thank you, Riley. Thank you for taking the time today to moderate for us. And I would also like to thank Kiyoshi and Wayne for joining us and providing their excellent insights on Japan and China respectively. We were honored to host you and appreciate the time you've taken out of your busy schedules. And we're out of time. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we'll be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. So with that, thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a great Thanksgiving.